Welcome, everybody. And Boris, it's great to have the opportunity to spend some time together at Benzinga. And last time we visited, you articulated to us your vision for the next 18 or 24 months. And I'm pleased to say that you've demonstrated through your actions what your plans could become, posting a fantastic year-end number and one of the great success stories in the industry. It's wonderful to see a company that's able to execute on a global basis, grow their business, and be able to generate over $25 million in free cash flow. So we all congratulate you on your success to date.
Thank you.
Boris, let's take a few minutes and just go through how you see the next 24 months, where you see Curaleaf and the broader industry. Let's just start with the company, and what are some of the pivotal moments that you see ahead for the future of the business?
I think there's a lot of major catalysts that are coming up, and I'll focus outside of the regulatory nature, but they're really business catalysts. And I would say that's in the United States, it's Ohio, obviously in the second half of this year. It's obviously the New York catalyst that is happening as we speak. It's obviously the Florida catalyst that's going to be voted on in November. And what we think will probably be Pennsylvania sometime at the end of this year or early next year. We probably will see a catalyst there as well. So there's some meaningful growth catalysts in the United States over the next 12 to 24 months. And I think very excited about them because they're going to return, for those companies that are in those markets, they're going to return the industry to double-digit growth rates. So I'm very excited about that, and that's where we should be. For Curaleaf specifically, there's also the European play, and there we don't have to wait for the catalyst anymore. It's happened. So the major catalyst was the German news on taking cannabis off the narcotics list. And we've seen some very, very bullish signs in the first 2 weeks in terms of the numbers that we've seen coming off of the telemedicine platforms as well as the business itself.
So Boris, that brings up an interesting point because we have seen favorable reaction to what may be transformative legislation out of Florida. But when you look at Germany and the greater European market, it's actually far larger, yet there doesn't seem to be the same sort of awareness as to the possibility of what this regulatory reform means to the business in the immediate future, in the now sense. Can you talk a little bit about the opportunity ahead in Germany and throughout Europe?
Yeah. I think one of the problems is that as someone who's basically spent the bulk of my professional career actually in Europe, and I've only recently moved back to the United States over the last 8 years. I can tell you that there's one thing I was shocked by when I came back to the US as to how little knowledge there is in the US about a lot of things that take place outside the US. We have very much a fortress mentality in the United States, and probably deserved because we're the largest economy in the world. But Europe, if you look at Europe as a whole, it's a much bigger economy than the United States. And although Europe is not an easy place to do business, if you get in early enough, you can do very well there. And I had a lot of experience in my past life. I built one of the biggest data center operators in the world in Europe. And so I operated in all these countries that we're now operating in for the cannabis industry. And so I know a little bit of the lay of the land, and it was a natural place for Curaleaf to expand because of my background in operating in Europe for almost 30 years. And what we're seeing today in Germany and in the UK and now in Poland is we're starting to see very substantial markets. Let's just make a comparison. Let's take Germany and Florida, where we are today. So Florida has a $2.5 billion medical market with around a 2.5% penetration of the population. So just to put things into perspective, that same penetration in Germany on 82 million people would probably be a $6 to $8 billion medical market. And today, we're at 200,000 patients. Now, in the first 2 weeks, and it's very early, obviously the numbers are not what market's going to represent. But in the first 2 weeks since they removed cannabis from the narcotics list, we've seen a 5-fold increase in patients approaching the telemedicine platforms, to the point where the telemedicine platforms have stopped taking new appointments because they've got so many appointments they don't have enough doctors to prescribe the medicine. So, and at Curaleaf, we've seen in the first week a 70% increase in orders by pharmacies, and in the second week a 50% increase, and that's at a period of time where they normally don't buy. So the tradition normally is in the last week of every month, pharmacies order from the big wholesalers like Curaleaf for their product. But even before that, we got massive increases in sales in the first and second week. So we'll be very curious to see what it looks like in the fourth week, which is next week, when the pharmacies put in their big orders. So, and this is surprising to us, because we actually thought that we wouldn't see these orders until the third quarter. Like we thought that the patient growth would start, they'd start visiting doctors, they'd start making orders, but we wouldn't see the real growth until the third quarter, but we're actually seeing it in the first 2 weeks already. So I think Germany is going to be a much, much bigger market than Florida. And you know, what nobody in the world really appreciates is that Curaleaf has a 23% share in that market. And we have a very strong brand positioning. And if you look at what Florida did to some of the cannabis stocks, we didn't even get a bump for what is the largest market, maybe one of the largest markets in the world.
Yeah, offering a great access point for investors. So Boris, just a little bit more before we leave the European theater, and just inform the audience somewhat about the similarities and the differences between the United States market and the European market, especially as it relates to production and cross-border sales.
So Europe has the benefit of all the programs in Europe are federally legal, to put it in the US context. So it's not regional programs like in the United States that are legal in the states but illegal at the federal level. All the programs in Europe are done from the federal level. So it's a 100% legal framework across the continent. And what that means is that we can manufacture and grow in one location and distribute to all the markets. And what Curaleaf did, and there's a huge moat. It's very difficult to get into Europe now because every flower strain takes a year to get approved. Like, it's very, very difficult to get these flower strains approved. So we started 3 years ago, and that's why we started so early. We got a lot of criticism for it, but we started early, and now we have a 50% share in the UK, 23% share in Germany, and we're just building our business in Poland, which is a very large market, going to be a very large market. And the real difference is your cost of capital is much, much lower because you're legal, so you can bank it. Like, we hold our accounts at Barclays. That's like having your accounts at JP Morgan in the US, right? So you can't do that. I can tell you, Curaleaf does not have any accounts at JP Morgan. So in Europe, we bank with large banks. We can get financing. We can get equity financing from large sovereign wealth funds. We can get debt financing. So the business is a very different business in Europe. It's much more customary to what you see in the US in legal businesses versus the world we live in cannabis.
Interesting. And what about the consumer? And that will bring us back to your brand strategy.
So the consumer is, in my opinion, the consumers globally are pretty similar. There's some differences in terms of preferences, but the European consumer right now is very medically driven. And it's kind of like where we were in 2015, 2016 in the United States. So we're at the very early stages of what I anticipate to be pretty explosive growth. And the consumer is looking for safe, well-priced products and diversified products. For instance, Curaleaf is the only company in the UK that offers both flower, vapes, and gummies, so edibles. Nobody else offers all three of those products, so we got them all approved through the regulators in the UK. In Germany at the moment, there's only 2 products that are approved, which is flower and tinctures. We're mainly in the flower market, but we're about to enter over the next couple of months. We're going to enter the tincture market as well. The margins in the tincture market are just a lot lower than they are in the flower market, so we've been sticking to the flower market. And Poland just opened its market. It's largely flower at the moment, but we anticipate that growing. And we just announced this, last 2 weeks ago, we announced an acquisition in Canada for our supply chain for Europe. It's high-end EU GMP indoor grown flower, and we grow in Portugal greenhouse EU GMP certified flower. So we have now the full spectrum from high-end to mid-market flower that we can deliver through all of Europe. And so, we were lucky. We got in on time, and now we have the full supply chain to supply all the markets in Europe, both on the flower side and on the product side. And we've built our reputation and our brand. And my goal, and I know that's where you're leading, is I want worldwide Curaleaf, Select, all of our brands to be the most recognized. And with this new acquisition we made in Canada, they had a business in Australia and New Zealand, so we're not looking at those two markets to see if we want to enter those markets with this acquisition and start to push our brand. So my goal, while I'm still working with Matt on Curaleaf, is to make sure that Curaleaf brands are the most recognized brands globally in the cannabis space, because I think that's where the value is.
I think you're right. The brand strategy is critically important. And the European consumer, do you see them valuing levels of THC like the American consumer does, or they're still nascent in their development?
So there's some of that, but I would argue because of the regulatory framework, it's not as prevalent as the United States. And I also want to say that I think the U.S. is slowly starting to shift from that strategy, very slowly. Because the fact is, everybody knows it's not the THC that gives you the entourage effect, it's the terpenes on the plant, right? And so the higher the THC, it doesn't necessarily make the plant a better plant for your purposes of use. So I think the U.S., we're seeing more and more consumers, particularly if you look at the Reddit pages and everything, start to talk about terps, start to talk about flower structure, bud structure. So these are very important things, because let's be honest, this race for THC is not good for anybody. I don't think the regulators like it. I don't think that it's good for the consumer. And I also think that a lot of the THC levels are just bullshit.
Right. But I think a lot of the success of your brand strategy is helping educate the consumer about that.
We're trying to do it all the time across, different forums in the United States, of course, in Europe and everywhere. If you're a market leader, you have to behave like a leader, and so you do have to educate. And listen, we don't get everything perfect, but we're really trying to make sure that the consumer understands the products that they're using, why they're using them, for what purposes. And obviously, in the U.S., it's different. The U.S., up until last year, we were still more than 50% medical business. Now, with all the stuff happening in the U.S., we're more of a adult use driven market than we are a medical market, although we still have a very large percentage of our business is medical. In Europe, it's all medical, and I don't see that changing for 5 years. I think the European market is going through what the U.S. did. We're going to go medical in all the countries first, and then we'll go adult use after they get comfortable and the stigmas start to drop off. And Germany was the first step for that.
Well, it's incredibly valuable, the experience that you have and your team has had building a business in the United States, all the learnings that you've gone through to be able to now implement that anew in Europe. So that, I think, gives you a certain strategic advantage. In the last minute that we have left, I think we would be remiss if we didn't just spend one moment and talk about rescheduling and get your perspective on that.
So I think that we all know about the same. I don't have any more information about what's happening on rescheduling, maybe on SAFER, but on rescheduling than anybody else in this room, right? The DEA holds things close to their chest. I may know some of the procedural aspects better. There was a lot of Twitter chatter over the last 24 hours about the comments made by the President Biden's spokesman in Washington yesterday. She didn't say anything that insiders in the sector already don't know, and that is that this is with the DOJ. Whether she meant that it was with the DA, which is underneath the DOJ, or whether it's with the DOJ proper in their legal department is almost irrelevant. At this point in time, it's where it's supposed to be. It's getting reviewed. 2 weeks prior to that, we had a very unusual statement from the DA that basically said that they take normally 6 months to get to some kind of a conclusion after they got it. Let's be honest, that they got literally April 24th will be 6 months since the HSS and the FDA recommended. So, but it's politics too. So I'm not going to go into all the details because we don't have any time of whether they're going to have a comment period or they're going to go to rulemaking, because we don't know that. The point I want to make is that I think this is coordinated, in my opinion. I don't think this is all by accident. I don't think the president, I lost personal money. I bet that the president would never mention cannabis in the State of the Union, and he did. I think that's a hugely positive step. I didn't think he would do it. So I do think that things are heading in the right direction, and I just want to say one thing. We all need to be a little patient. People are going absolutely crazy about this, and I think we're very close to it. I think something's going to happen very soon, and I think we all got to just calm down and wait for it to happen and focus on building good companies.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Boris. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And thank you, Benzinga.
Thank you.